A baby is abandoned on the road under the darkness of night, but something in the forest awaits him. Years later, secrets from the past return, and he discovers that his connection to the unknown is far greater than he ever imagined. The morning breeze gently rustled through the treetops in Shenandoah National Park, carrying with it the unique aroma of the Appalachian forest. Ethan, a 12-year-old boy with amber eyes, sat on the highest branch of an ancient oak tree, watching the sunrise with a familiarity that few would have at that height. His bare feet dangled in the air as his ears picked up every small sound of the forest awakening. For as long as he could remember, Ethan had always had this special connection with nature. It was as if every moving leaf told a story, every singing bird transmitted a secret message. But what intrigued his adoptive parents, Mark and Sarah Parker, most was his inexplicable bond with the wolves in the region. "Ethan, breakfast is ready," Sarah's voice echoed across the property, making the boy smile. With the agility of someone born to climb, he descended the tree in precise movements, his feet finding support in the irregularities of the trunk, as if he knew them by heart. The Parker's house was a mix of research station and cozy home. Scientific equipment shared space with rustic furniture, and the walls were decorated with photos of local wildlife, many of them taken by Mark himself on his expeditions. The aroma of fresh coffee and homemade bread filled the air, but it was the smell of wild honey that made Ethan's stomach growl. "I thought you might prefer to have breakfast up there today," commented Mark, adjusting his glasses while analyzing some notes in his field journal. His adoptive father was a man of medium height, with prematurely graying hair and an eternal look of curiosity in his eyes. "I was going to, but I smelled the honey Mom harvested yesterday," replied Ethan, sitting at the table and immediately reaching for the glass jar. Sarah, a woman with delicate features and dark hair tied in a messy bun, watched her son with a smile that barely disguised her concern. "Did you have another dream last night?" she asked, sitting down next to her husband. Ethan paused for a moment, the piece of bread suspended halfway to his mouth. The dreams had started a few weeks ago, always with the same elements repeating: a dark cave, ancient paintings on the walls, and a black wolf with golden eyes. "It was different this time," he replied after a pause. "I saw a man. He seemed important, wearing an expensive suit. He was standing by the side of the road looking at the forest, and there was something in his eyes. Sadness, I think." Mark and Sarah exchanged worried glances. It wasn't the first time Ethan had demonstrated a perception that went beyond normal. Since he was a baby when they found him in the forest on that peculiar morning, they knew there was something special about him. The way animals reacted to his presence, especially the wolves, was something that defied any scientific explanation. "Son," Sarah began, choosing her words carefully, "you know you can tell us anything, right? If you're feeling something different—" A distant howl interrupted her speech, making all three turn their heads towards the window. It was a familiar sound to Ethan, who was already getting up from his chair as if responding to a silent call. His eyes shone with a different intensity, and for a moment, Sarah could have sworn she saw a golden reflection pass through them. "I need to go," he said, already heading for the door. "Shadow is calling me." "Shadow?" questioned Mark, furrowing his brow. "Who's Shadow?" But Ethan had already left, his bare feet barely touching the ground as he ran towards the woods. "Mark!" And Sarah ran to the porch, watching their son disappear among the trees. In the distance, they saw a dark shape moving through the vegetation, following the boy's path. "Sometimes I wonder if we made the right choice," Sarah murmured, squeezing her husband's hand. "Keeping him here, away from everything." "It was the only possible choice," Mark replied, although his voice betrayed a hint of uncertainty. "But something is changing, Sarah. You feel it too, don't you?" She nodded silently, her eyes fixed on the point where Ethan had disappeared. The wind blew stronger, bringing with it the echo of another howl, closer this time. In the forest, the shadows moved, guarding secrets that would soon come to light. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you're watching us from. We'll continue. Ethan ran through the forest as if he knew every stone, every route, every curve of the terrain. His bare feet naturally found the best path, avoiding obstacles that other eyes would barely notice. The howl he had heard was not like the others. There was urgency in it, a call that made his heart beat faster. Among the trees, a dark shape moved parallel to his path. It was a wolf with fur as black as night, larger than any other in the region. Its golden eyes shone with an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. It was he whom Ethan called Shadow, although he couldn't explain where that name came from. He simply knew that was how he should call him. "What is it?" whispered Ethan, slowing his pace as he approached the animal. The wolf stopped, its ears moving alertly. With a smooth head movement, it indicated a specific direction. Ethan followed the animal's gaze and felt a shiver run down his spine. It was the path to the cave from his dreams. Meanwhile, in the small town near the park, a black car with tinted windows parked in front of the only small market in the area. From the vehicle, a tall man stepped out, wearing an impeccable suit that completely contrasted with the rural environment. His face had striking features and a discreet scar cut across his right eyebrow. "Good morning," he greeted, addressing the owner of the establishment. His voice was deep and controlled. "I'm looking for information about a family that lives around these parts, the Parkers." The shopkeeper, an elderly gentleman who knew everyone in the area, hesitated before answering. There was something in the stranger's gaze that made him uncomfortable. "The biologists? They live deeper in the park. They've been researching wildlife around here for years." "And they have a son, don't they?" continued the man, his eyes narrowing slightly. In the forest, Ethan and Shadow arrived at the entrance of the cave. It was a place that few knew about, hidden among rock formations and protected by a natural curtain of vines. The boy felt his heart race. It was exactly like in his dreams, every detail identical to the images that populated his nights. Shadow entered first, his paws silent on the rocky ground. Ethan followed, letting his eyes adapt to the dimness. As they advanced, the walls began to reveal ancient paintings, some so faded they could barely be distinguished. But there was one that stood out from the rest, as if time had not been able to erase it. The painting showed a human figure next to a black wolf, its arms raised in a gesture that seemed to invoke something from the heavens. In the center of the image, a circular symbol with internal spirals caught Ethan's attention. Instinctively, he touched his own arm where a birthmark formed a similar design. "What does this mean?" he murmured, more to himself than to Shadow. The wolf let out a low sound, almost a whimper, and gently pushed the boy's shoulder with his muzzle, guiding him further into the cave. It was then that Ethan noticed something that wasn't in his dreams: a narrow passage, partially hidden by a protrusion in the rock. Shadow was already heading there, his black body merging with the shadows of the place. Following the animal, Ethan squeezed through the passage, emerging into a smaller chamber that took his breath away. On the walls of this secret room, the paintings were different. They showed a sequence of scenes, people with symbols on their bodies, always accompanied by wolves. In one of the images, a group seemed to be performing some kind of ritual, and in the center was the same symbol that Ethan carried on his skin. Suddenly, a noise coming from the cave entrance made them both turn. Footsteps echoed off the stone walls, accompanied by the metallic sound of equipment. Shadow immediately took a defensive position, a low growl rising in his throat. "Are you sure he came this way?" an unfamiliar male voice asked. "Yes, the footprints are recent," another voice answered. "The boy is here somewhere." Ethan felt the blood freeze in his veins. The men spoke as if they knew him, as if they were looking for him specifically. Shadow looked at him, and then at a crack in the opposite wall, a possible escape route. The boy understood the silent message, but before moving, his eyes captured one last detail on the wall. Among the ancient paintings, there was a more recent mark, words written in an elegant calligraphy that seemed to glow in the darkness. In the dim light of the secret chamber, Ethan approached the wall where the words glowed faintly. The calligraphy was delicate, almost aristocratic, and seemed to have been written not too long ago. "To my grandson," the message said, "if you are reading this, it means that the blood of the Wilsons truly runs in your veins. There is much, more to your story than you imagine. Look for the bronze medallion in the third cave after the Red River. It is yours by right. With love, your grandfather. Ethan's heart raced. Grandson, grandfather, Wilson. His head was spinning with questions, but the approaching footsteps left no time for reflection. Shadow nudged his leg more urgently, indicating the crack in the wall. It was a narrow passage, but Ethan could fit through it. "Wait," he whispered, quickly taking his cell phone out of his pocket to photograph the message. His hands were shaking, but he managed to capture the image before following Shadow through the opening in the rock. The passage was a natural tunnel that snaked upwards, illuminated only by small cracks in the ceiling. The air was fresher there, suggesting there was an exit nearby. As they moved silently, Ethan could hear the men's voices echoing more and more distant. "Damn, the kid's not here," a frustrated voice resonated. "The boss isn't going to like this at all." "Calm down, he can't have gone far. Let's search the area." After a few minutes of tense walking, Ethan and Shadow emerged in a different part of the forest. The morning sun filtered through the leaves, creating golden patterns on the ground. They were in an area that the boy didn't recognize, higher and rockier than his usual territory. "We need to go back home," Ethan murmured, worried about his parents. Shadow, however, had other plans. The wolf began to walk in the opposite direction, occasionally stopping to check if the boy was following him. "Hey, where are you taking me?" questioned Ethan, torn between the need to return and curiosity about what the animal wanted to show him. Shadow just kept walking, his behavior more determined than usual. After about 20 minutes of walking, they reached a different clearing. In the center of it, an ancient tree stood out, its twisted trunk forming patterns that resembled old faces. Shadow approached its roots and began to dig at a specific point. "What did you find?" asked Ethan, crouching down next to the wolf. In a few seconds, something metallic glinted among the earth. It was a small metal box, corroded by time but still intact. With trembling hands, Ethan removed the box from the hole. It was surprisingly heavy for its size and had a familiar design engraved on the lid, the same symbol he carried on his arm. When he opened it, he found a yellowed envelope and an old photograph. The photo showed a young and beautiful woman, with the same amber eyes he had. She was holding a baby in her arms and smiling at the camera. Next to her was an older man with an elegant posture and a serious look, the same man Ethan had seen in his dreams. "Mom," he whispered, touching the image with his fingertips. It was the first time he had seen what she looked like. On the back of the photo was a date and 3 names: Elizabeth, William, and Ethan Wilson, 2013. The envelope contained a letter written in the same elegant handwriting as the message in the cave. Ethan began to read, his heart beating faster and faster. "My dear grandson, if you have found this box, it means that the forest guardians have fulfilled their mission. Yes, the wolves that have always protected you are not simple animals. They are the ancestral guardians of our family, a lineage that dates back to times that history has forgotten. Your mother, Elizabeth, discovered secrets that many wanted to keep hidden. She knew you would be special, that you would carry the gift that many in our family lost over generations. The symbol you bear on your arm is proof of this. There are people who fear our gift, who want to control or suppress it. That's why I had to make the hardest decision of my life that night. But know that I never completely abandoned you. The guardians were always watching, protecting, waiting for the right moment. The medallion I mentioned is the key to understanding your heritage, but be careful. Others are looking for it too. Trust the wolves, trust your instincts. They will guide you. With love, your grandfather, William Wilson." Ethan read the letter 3 times, trying to absorb every word. So many things were starting to make sense. His dreams, his connection with animals, the protective behavior of the wolves. But each answer brought with it new questions. A twig snapping nearby made Shadow raise his ears in alert. The wolf looked fixedly in one direction, his body tense. Ethan quickly put the letter and photo back in the box, stuffing it into his backpack. Not far away, voices and footsteps were approaching. "We have to go," he whispered, and Shadow agreed with a nod. Together they began to move silently through the forest, taking a different path than they had come. The sun was already high in the sky, and Ethan knew his parents must be worried. But now he had something more urgent to worry about. Finding the medallion before those mysterious men did. Mark and Sarah were walking nervously on the porch of the house, checking the clock every few minutes. It was already past noon, and Ethan still hadn't returned. Breakfast remained untouched on the table, a silent witness to the growing concern. "I'm going to look for him," Mark decided, grabbing his equipment backpack. But before he could take 2 steps, a black car appeared on the dirt road leading to the house. The vehicle advanced slowly as if its driver was studying the terrain. "Sarah," Mark called in a low voice, "go inside and lock the doors." The car parked in the yard, and 2 men got out. The first, wearing an impeccable suit, had a striking face and a scar on his eyebrow. The second was younger, carrying a briefcase. They approached with determined steps. "Good afternoon," said the man with the scar, his deep voice echoing in the silence of the property. "I'm Richard Veras, representing the interests of the Wilson family. We need to talk about Ethan." Mark felt the blood freeze in his veins. In 12 years, no one had questioned Ethan's origin, and now suddenly, mysterious people appeared mentioning a name he had never heard. "I don't know what you're talking about," Mark replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "If you'll excuse us." "I believe you know very well," interrupted Richard, taking an envelope from the briefcase his assistant was holding. "We have detailed records of the day you found the boy in the forest, July 12th, 2013. A newborn child, wrapped in high-quality blankets, with a peculiar symbol on his right arm." Sarah, who was watching everything through the window, felt her legs weaken. How could they know so many details? "What do you want?" asked Mark, his posture changing from defensive to protective. Just to talk," Richard replied, his tone softening slightly. "Ethan is part of a much bigger story than you imagine, a story that began generations ago and that now needs to be resolved." At that moment, a familiar howl cut through the air, making everyone turn. At the edge of the forest, Ethan emerged from the trees, shadow by his side. The boy looked different. There was a new awareness in his gaze, a more confident posture in his movements. "Finally," murmured Richard, an enigmatic smile forming on his lips. "Ethan, come inside," shouted Sarah, but the boy didn't move. His eyes were fixed on Richard, as if trying to decipher something in his presence. "Do you work for my grandfather?" asked Ethan, his voice surprisingly firm. The question caught everyone by surprise, especially Mark and Sarah, who exchanged confused looks. Richard adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable with the direct question. "It's complicated, young Ethan. Let's say I've been taking care of the Wilson family's interests for a long time." "And were you the ones following me in the cave?" continued Ethan, taking a step forward. Shadow accompanied his movement, staying close, his golden eyes fixed on the strangers. "Cave?" questioned Richard, frowning. "What cave?" It was then that Ethan realized. The man was genuinely surprised. Whoever had been in the cave earlier, they weren't the same people who were now at his house. "Ethan!" called Sarah, her voice trembling slightly. "What are you talking about? What's this story about a grandfather?" The boy took the metal box out of his backpack, revealing the photo and the letter. "I found this today. My real name is Ethan Wilson, and it seems there are people very interested in finding me." Richard took a step towards the box, but Shadow emitted a low and threatening growl, making him back away. Other wolves began to emerge from the forest, moving silently until they formed a semicircle behind Ethan. "Impossible," murmured Richard's assistant, letting the briefcase fall to the ground. Papers scattered with the wind, and among them, Ethan saw other ancient documents, all with the same symbol he carried on his arm. "I think," said Ethan, his voice carrying an authority that no one expected from a 12-year-old boy, "that we all have a lot to talk about. But first I need to know exactly who you are and why there are other people looking for me." The wind blew stronger, rustling the leaves of the trees. In the sky, dark clouds were beginning to form, as if nature itself was responding to the tension of the moment. Mark and Sarah watched the scene, divided between fear and pride for the son they had raised. Richard Veras, in turn, seemed to be recalculating every aspect of his mission, realizing that what he had found was much more complex than he had expected. The Parkers' living room had never seemed so small as it did that afternoon. Mark and Sarah occupied the worn sofa, their hands intertwined in a silent gesture of mutual support. Richard Veras sat in an armchair near the window, his impeccable suit contrasting with the rustic environment. Ethan remained standing close to the door leading to the porch, where Shadow stood guard, his golden eyes attentive to every movement. "Start from the beginning," Ethan demanded, his voice firm despite his age. "I want to know everything about my family." Richard adjusted his posture, carefully choosing his words. "The Wilson family is not an ordinary family, Ethan. For generations, its members were known to have a special connection with nature, particularly with wolves. As guardians," Ethan completed, remembering the letter. "Exactly," confirmed Richard, a flash of surprise crossing his face. "But this gift was lost over time. Many thought it was just a family legend, until your mother, Elizabeth, began researching our history." "And where is she now?" asked Sarah, her voice betraying the maternal concern she felt for both Ethan and this unknown woman. Richard hesitated, his gaze briefly meeting that of his assistant before continuing. "Elizabeth, she had to distance herself. Her discoveries attracted unwanted attention. There are people who believe that certain secrets should remain buried." Thunder rumbled in the distance, making the windows tremble. The storm that was forming seemed to respond to the growing tension in the room. "The men in the cave," Ethan murmured, more to himself than to the others. "They're not with you, are they?" "What men?" asked Richard, leaning forward. "Ethan, it's very important that you tell me exactly what happened today." The boy described his encounter in the cave, the message on the wall, and the discovery of the box with the letter and photo. As he spoke, he noticed how Richard grew increasingly pale. "This changes everything," said the man, standing up abruptly. "We need to get you out of here immediately. If they discovered the cave, it won't be long until—" "He's not going anywhere," interrupted Mark, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone. "Ethan is our son, regardless of what his last name says." "You don't understand," insisted Richard. "What's at stake is much bigger than a custody issue. The society—" He stopped talking abruptly, as if he had said something he shouldn't. His assistant coughed nervously, shuffling the papers he had collected from the ground. "What society?" questioned Ethan, his eyes shining with an unusual intensity. Before Richard could answer, Shadow emitted a low growl. Outside, other wolves began to stir, their dark forms moving restlessly among the trees. "They're coming," said Ethan, his voice changing to a tone that no one in the room recognized. It was ancient, carrying knowledge that seemed to come from another time. Richard pulled a phone from his pocket, dialing quickly. "We need to go now. There's a safe place—" "No," interrupted Ethan, walking to the center of the room. "I'm not going to run away. The medallion is nearby, I can feel it. And whoever is coming, they know that too." "The bronze medallion?" asked Richard, surprised. "How do you know about it?" "My grandfather left a message, third cave after the Red River." Ethan turned to Mark and Sarah. "Do you know that place?" Mark furrowed his brow, thoughtful. "The Red River? Yes. Locals call it that because of the iron-rich soil that stains its waters. There's a cave system around there, but we never explored much beyond the second, because the wolves always prevented us from going further," completed Sarah, a new understanding dawning in her gaze. "They were protecting something," concluded Ethan, "and now it's time to find out what." At that moment, Shadow entered the room, his movements urgent. Through the window, everyone could see flashlight beams moving among the trees, approaching the house. "It's them," whispered Richard's assistant, his face pale with fear. "The Society of Shadow Guardians," Richard quickly explained. "They consider themselves the true protectors of ancient secrets. They believe that people like you, Ethan, are a threat to the balance they've maintained for centuries." "But why?" asked Sarah, instinctively hugging her son. "Because," answered Ethan, his eyes fixed on the approaching shadows, "they're afraid of what they can't control, and now they know I can do something they can't." As if responding to his words, a powerful howl cut through the night, followed by another and another. It was an ancestral call, a sound that carried the weight of generations of guardians. The pack was gathering, and for the first time in his life, Ethan fully understood his role in this story that was much bigger than he had ever imagined. Night had fallen over Shenandoah National Park, bringing with it a darkness different from any other Ethan had ever known. The storm clouds blocked the starlight, and the only luminous points were the flashlights moving among the trees, getting closer and closer to the Parkers' house. "We have to go to the Red River now," Ethan declared, his voice carrying an urgency that made everyone in the room move. "It's too dangerous," protested Richard. "In the dark, with this storm coming." "That's exactly why we have to go," interrupted the boy. "They won't follow us easily in these conditions, and besides," he looked at Shadow, who maintained his proud posture by his side, "we won't be alone." Mark quickly grabbed his equipment, backpacks, already prepared for emergencies. Years of field research had taught him to always keep the essentials at hand. Sarah, in turn, ran to the kitchen, filling canteens with water and gathering some food. "I know an alternative path," said Mark, checking his compass. "Through the rhododendron valley. It's longer but offers more cover." Richard and his assistant exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," insisted Richard. "The society has resources, technology, and we have the true guardians," replied Ethan, his hand resting on Shadow's head. As if confirming his words, a chorus of howls echoed through the forest, much closer now. The group left through the back of the house, moving silently through the dense vegetation. Shadow led the way, followed by Ethan and his parents. Richard and his assistant came right behind, constantly looking back. As they advanced through the forest, other wolves joined them, emerging from the shadows like silent specters. Ethan could feel their presence, not just physically, but in a deeper way, as if each animal was an extension of his own consciousness. "There," whispered Mark, after almost an hour of walking, pointing to a reddish coloration that stood out even in the darkness. The Red River snaked through the valley below, its dark waters reflecting the last remnants of light. A stronger thunder shook the air and the first raindrops began to fall. The wind increased, making the treetops dance violently. "The first cave is just past that rock formation," explained Mark, his voice almost lost in the growing noise of the storm. As they approached the river, Ethan felt something strange, a vibration in the air, a silent call that seemed to come from the stones themselves. Shadow also noticed, his ears moving alertly. "Wait," said the boy, raising his hand. Everyone stopped, watching him expectantly. Ethan closed his eyes, concentrating on that sensation. It was as if the earth was trying to tell him something, as if the rocks held ancient memories that only he could access. "It's not that way," he declared, opening his eyes. "The third cave, it doesn't follow the obvious sequence." "What do you mean?" asked Sarah, shielding her eyes from the rain that was getting stronger. Ethan began to walk, not following the course of the river, but climbing a steep slope. Shadow and the other wolves followed him without hesitation. "The ancient guardians," he explained as he climbed, his words coming out between panting breaths. "They didn't think like we do. For them, the third cave wasn't the third in distance, but the third in a sacred pattern." After a few minutes of difficult climbing, they reached a ledge in the rock. There, partially hidden by vegetation and erosion, was an opening that would be impossible to notice without knowing exactly where to look. "How did you know?" asked Richard, his voice betraying a mixture of admiration and concern. "I didn't know," Ethan replied simply. "They showed me." He gestured to the wolves surrounding them, their dark forms almost indistinguishable in the storm. A new thunder illuminated the sky, and for a moment, everyone could clearly see what was engraved in the rock beside the entrance, the same symbol that Ethan carried on his arm, carved into the stone centuries ago. "We need to enter," said the boy, his voice changing to that ancient tone again. "The medallion is calling us." But before they could take a step towards the cave, a noise of rolling stones above them caught their attention. Flashlights lit up at the top of the slope, revealing silhouettes of men rapidly descending in their direction. "They found us," murmured Richard's assistant, his face pale with fear. Shadow and the other wolves immediately took defensive positions, their low growls mixing with the sound of the storm. Ethan looked at the cave entrance and then at his parents, a difficult decision forming in his eyes. "We don't have much time," he said, his voice firm despite the chaos forming around him, "and what's in here is too important to fall into the wrong hands." The cave entrance revealed itself to be wider than it initially appeared. Ethan led the group with Shadow by his side, while Mark illuminated the way with his most powerful flashlight. The heavy rain created a curtain of water at the entrance, isolating them from the outside world. "Some wolves stayed outside," said Ethan, his voice echoing off the rocky walls. "They'll buy us time." The interior of the cave was unlike anything they had ever seen. The walls weren't simply rocky. They were covered with ancient engravings and symbols, some so delicate they seemed to have been made with the precision of a jeweler. "Incredible," murmured Mark, his researcher instinct momentarily overcoming fear. "These symbols, they seem to tell a story." "And they do," confirmed Richard, running his fingers over one of the engravings. "The story of the first Wilsons and how they discovered their gift." Sarah, who was a few steps ahead, called the group's attention. "Look at this!" Everyone approached a specific section of the wall where the engravings formed an elaborate scene. It showed a human figure standing, surrounded by wolves, with hands raised towards what appeared to be a full moon. "It's the story of the first guardian," explained Richard, his voice taking on a tone of reverence. "Helena Wilson. They say she was the first to discover she could communicate with wolves. This was over 300 years ago." "But why was this so important?" asked Sarah, observing the details of the engraving. "Because she didn't just communicate with them," Ethan responded, his eyes fixed on the image. "She could see through their eyes, feel what they felt. It was a much deeper connection than anyone imagined possible." Richard looked at the boy with astonishment. "How do you know that?" "I just know," replied Ethan, touching the symbol on his arm. "It's as if the memories have been here all along, just waiting to be awakened." A distant noise of footsteps and voices echoed through the cave, reminding them of the urgency of their situation. "This way," indicated Ethan, guiding them through a side corridor that would be easily overlooked by someone who didn't know of its existence. The tunnel narrowed as they advanced, and the air became denser. The walls now exhibited a faint glow, as if small crystals were embedded in the rock. "They're quartz crystals," explained Mark, examining the walls. "But I've never seen anything like this. They seem alive." Suddenly, Shadow stopped, his ears moving alertly. Ethan felt it too, a vibration in the air, an energy that made the crystals glow more intensely. "We're close," he whispered. The tunnel opened into a circular chamber, much larger than the previous ones. In the center stood a simple stone altar, and upon it, "The medallion," murmured Richard, his eyes wide. It was an ancient bronze piece the size of a palm. Its surface was covered with engravings similar to those on the walls, but what drew the most attention was the stone in the center, a quartz crystal that pulsed with its own light. Ethan took a step towards the altar, but Richard held him back. "Wait," he said, his voice tense. "You don't understand what this means. The medallion isn't just a relic. It's the key to something much bigger." "I know," replied Ethan, surprising everyone. "It's the key to awakening the others." "Others?" asked Sarah, confused. "Others like me," explained Ethan. "People who were born with the gift but never knew it. The medallion can help them awaken, just as the symbols in this cave helped me understand who I am." A new sound of footsteps echoed through the cave, closer now. The voices of the pursuers were clearer, and with them came a smell of smoke. "They're using torches," said Mark, concerned. "In a cave full of quartz crystals, this could be dangerous." "We have no choice," declared Ethan, advancing towards the altar. "The medallion can't fall into their hands." But when his fingers were about to touch the ancient bronze, a familiar voice echoed through the chamber. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, young Wilson." Everyone turned towards the chamber entrance. There, emerging from the shadows with a torch in one hand and a metallic object in the other, was Richard's assistant. His face, previously timid and nervous, now displayed a cold and calculating smile. "Michael," asked Richard, disbelief in his voice. "What are you doing?" "My job," replied the assistant, his smile widening. "The Society of Shadow Guardians sends its regards." The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of Michael's torch. The crystals on the walls seemed to pulse more intensely, as if responding to the tension in the air. "You deceived us all this time," said Richard, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Deceived?" Michael laughed humorlessly. "I did my job. The society needed someone close to you, monitoring your movements. It was so easy, the shy and dedicated assistant, always in the background, always observing." Ethan remained near the altar, his eyes alternating between Michael and the medallion. Shadow positioned himself protectively in front of him, a low growl growing in his throat. "You don't understand what's at stake," continued Michael, taking a step forward. "The Wilson gift. It's too dangerous to be allowed. The world has a natural order that must be preserved." "Natural order?" questioned Ethan, his voice carrying a maturity beyond his years. "It was nature that gave us this gift. The wolves chose to accept us, to protect us." "Wolves are just animals," Michael exploded. "They should remain so. What your family does, what you can do, is an aberration." At that moment, more men began to enter the chamber, all carrying torches. The heat increased, making the crystals on the walls emit an increasingly intense glow. "Mark," whispered Sarah, noticing small cracks beginning to form on the walls. "The crystals, and they're reacting to the heat." Ethan noticed it too. The energy in the air was changing, becoming denser, more volatile. The medallion on its pedestal began to vibrate subtly. "Last chance, Ethan," said Michael, raising the metallic object he was carrying, a kind of device that emitted a low hum. "Step away from the altar." But Ethan didn't move. Instead, he closed his eyes for a moment, as if listening to something that no one else could hear. "They're coming," he murmured. "Who's coming?" asked Michael, a touch of concern in his voice. As an answer, a powerful howl echoed through the cave, followed by another and another. They didn't just come from the entrance, they seemed to come from all directions, as if the mountain itself was responding to the call. "Impossible," whispered Michael, his face losing color. The other entrances were blocked. "You still don't understand, do you?" said Ethan, opening his eyes. There was something different in them now, a golden glow similar to Shadow's eyes. "Wolves don't need entrances. They know paths that men will never find." As if responding to his words, wolves began to emerge from the shadows, their eyes gleaming in the darkness. They came from invisible cracks, from forgotten tunnels converging on the chamber in supernatural silence. "Now!" shouted Michael to his men, raising the device. But before they could act, Ethan touched the medallion. The moment his fingers made contact with the ancient bronze, a wave of energy pulsed through the environment. The crystals on the walls shone with blinding intensity, and each wolf in the chamber raised its head in a unison howl. The energy seemed to flow through Ethan, connecting him not only to the present wolves, but to something much older and deeper. In his mind, he saw flashes of other times, Helena Wilson discovering her gift for the first time, generations of guardians protecting the family secrets, his own mother, Elizabeth, trying to awaken others like him. "What's happening?" shouted Michael, retreating from the intense light. "The awakening," replied Ethan, his voice blended with echoes of all the generations that came before him. "Not just mine, but of all who carry the gift." The society's men began to retreat, their torches falling to the ground. The wolves advanced slowly, not to attack, but forming a perfect circle around the altar. "You have a choice now, Michael," said Ethan, the medallion glowing in his hands. "You can continue fighting against something you don't understand, or you can open your eyes to the truth." The cave walls trembled, not in a threatening way, but as if the earth itself was awakening from a long sleep. The crystals pulsed in, a rhythm that resembled heartbeats, creating patterns of light that danced through the chamber. The air in the cave vibrated with an ancient energy, while the crystals continued pulsing in a hypnotic dance of light. Michael and his men were cornered against one of the walls, surrounded by wolves that maintained a perfect formation, their golden eyes gleaming in the twilight. "You have no idea what you're unleashing," said Michael, his voice trembling slightly, as he watched the medallion in Ethan's hands. "There's a reason we kept this hidden for so long." Ethan held the medallion firmly, feeling it pulse in sync with the crystals. Each beat seemed to awaken more memories, more knowledge buried in the depths of time. "I can see now," he murmured, his eyes still shining with that supernatural golden tone. "I can see everything you tried to hide." Images flowed through him like a river of memories. Helena Wilson, the first guardian, discovering that she could communicate not just with wolves but with the very essence of nature. Generations of Wilsons using their gift to protect the lands and their creatures. And then, the formation of the society. "You didn't start out like this, did you?" asked Ethan, looking directly at Michael. "The Society of Shadow Guardians, in the beginning you were allies." Richard took a step forward, his expression changing with a sudden understanding. "It's true, I found old records. The society was founded to protect the gift-bearers, not to suppress them." "Lies!" shouted Michael. But there was something in his eyes, fear perhaps or guilt. "We always knew the gift was too dangerous to be shared," interrupted a new voice, echoing through the chamber. Everyone turned to one of the side entrances of the cave. There, emerging from the shadows as if she had been conjured by the memories themselves, was a woman. Her dark hair was sprinkled with grey, but her eyes, the same amber eyes as Ethan's, shone with an indomitable strength. "Mom," whispered Ethan, his heart racing. Elizabeth Wilson crossed the chamber with firm steps, the wolves respectfully making way for her to pass. Her face showed signs of time and the trial she had faced, but there was an unbreakable dignity in her posture. "You've grown so much," she said softly, stopping a few steps from Ethan. Her eyes filled with contained tears, but her smile was radiant. Where have you been?" asked Ethan, his voice choked with emotion. "Looking for answers," Elizabeth replied, "and others like us. There are more, Ethan, many more than the society wants to admit." Michael let out a bitter laugh. "And that's exactly why we have to stop this. Don't you see, Elizabeth? If everyone with the gift awakens, the world will change," she completed. "Yes, it will change, as it should have changed a long time ago." Elizabeth approached the altar, her fingers lightly touching the ancient engravings. "The society forgot its true mission. You became so obsessed with maintaining control that you forgot why the gift exists in the first place." The crystals on the walls pulsed more intensely, responding to her words. Shadow approached her, touching his muzzle to her hand in a gesture of recognition. "The gift isn't about power," Elizabeth continued, looking at her son. "It's about connection, about understanding that we're not separate from nature, we're part of it." "And that's why you had to leave?" asked Sarah, taking a step forward. There was a mixture of gratitude and maternal protection in her voice. Elizabeth looked at her with a gentle smile. "Yes, and I'm eternally grateful that you took such good care of my son. You kept him safe until he was ready." "Ready for what?" asked Mark. "To make a choice," Elizabeth replied, turning to Ethan. "The medallion you hold isn't just a relic. Son, it's a catalyst. With it you can awaken all those who carry the dormant gift. But you can also choose to seal this power forever, as the society has always wanted." The weight of that revelation fell upon everyone in the chamber. The wolves moved restlessly, their golden eyes fixed on Ethan. Michael and his men remained motionless, tense, waiting. "And if I choose to awaken the others?" asked Ethan, his voice echoing in the cave. "Then the world that the society built will crumble," Michael quickly replied. "There will be chaos, people with powers they don't understand." "There will be change," Elizabeth corrected, "and with it the chance to reconnect humanity with something we lost long ago." Ethan looked at the medallion in his hands, feeling its power pulse. In his mind echoed the voices of generations of guardians, each having faced their own choice, their own moment of decision. If this story interested you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give it a like. Tell us which city you'll be watching us from. We'll continue. The silence in the cave was dense, laden with expectation. Ethan looked alternately at the medallion in his hands and at the people around him, His biological mother, who had sacrificed everything to protect him, his adoptive parents, who had raised him with so much love, Richard, who had tried to help, him in his own way, and Michael, whose fear of the unknown had led him to dark choices. "How does it work?" Ethan finally asked, his eyes meeting his mother's. Elizabeth approached, her movements as smooth as water. "The medallion is like a key, but it's also an amplifier. It can expand our natural connection with the Guardians to reach all those who carry the dormant gift." "No!" shouted Michael, taking a step forward. Immediately, several wolves growled in warning, making him retreat. "You don't understand, there are thousands of them. People who don't even know they carry this power. If they all awaken at once, they will discover who they truly are," Elizabeth completed. "As you discovered, Ethan, slowly, naturally, each in their own time." The crystals on the walls were pulsing more intensely now, creating patterns of light that danced through the chamber like underground auroras. Ethan could feel the power growing, not just from the medallion, but from something deeper, more ancient. "But what if Michael is right?" he asked, his voice betraying his concern. "What if it's too dangerous?" It was Mark who answered, surprising. "Everyone. Son, in all these years studying nature, I've learned one thing. The real danger isn't in the power itself, but in the fear we have of it." Sarah nodded, adding, "We've seen how you grew, how your connection with the wolves has always been natural, instinctive. There was never any malice in it." "You can't be seriously considering this," protested Michael, his face pale with concern. "The natural order—" "The natural order?" interrupted Elizabeth, her voice carrying the weight of years of knowledge. "What you call the natural order is a cage that you built, Michael. The gift of the Guardians is as natural as the rising sun or the cycle of seasons." Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the medallion pulse in his hands. Through it, he could sense other presences, distant but connected, people like him carrying a dormant spark of the same ancestral gift. "I can feel them," he murmured. "They're like sleeping lights, scattered across the world." Shadow approached, touching his muzzle to Ethan's free hand. Other wolves moved too, forming a perfect circle around the altar. The energy in the cave increased, making the crystals shine like stars. "The choice is yours, son," Elizabeth said softly. "It always has been." Ethan opened his eyes, which now shone with an even greater golden intensity. He looked at his adoptive parents, who watched him with love and trust. At Richard, who seemed to finally understand the true magnitude of what was happening, and at Michael, whose fear was almost palpable. "You're right about one thing, Michael," said Ethan. "The world will change, but maybe that's exactly what we need." With these words, he raised the medallion. The crystals on the walls exploded in light, and each wolf in the cave raised its head in a unison howl that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. The energy flowed through Ethan like a wave, expanding in concentric circles. Through this newly awakened connection, he could feel each person who carried the gift. Some nearby, others continents away. It wasn't a forced or sudden awakening, but a gentle call, an invitation to rediscover something that had always been there. "It's like waking up from a long dream," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. Michael fell to his knees, his device forgotten on the ground. His men watched the scene with a mixture of fear and awe, while the wolves maintained their position, silent guardians of a moment that would change the world forever. Elizabeth approached her son, placing a hand on his shoulder. "This is just the beginning," she said softly. "There's much more to learn, to understand." "And you'll stay?" asked Ethan, his voice small despite the power flowing through him. "Yes," she answered, looking also at Mark and Sarah. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to get to know better the wonderful young man my son has become." The crystals began to gradually dim their glow, but the energy they had released continued to reverberate through the world, touching those who, like Ethan, carried the gift of the Guardians in their blood. It was the beginning of a new era, an awakening that could not be undone. The days that followed the awakening in the cave brought changes that no one could have predicted. The Parker's house, once a tranquil refuge in the forest, became a meeting point for people who were beginning to discover their newly awakened gifts. Ethan watched from the porch as a group of young people learned from his mother the first steps of connecting with wolves. Elizabeth had settled in a small house built on the property, close enough to be present in her son's life, but respecting the space of the family that had raised him. "It's amazing how quickly they learn," commented Mark, joining Ethan on the porch. Father and son watched as a teenager managed for the first time to establish a clear connection with one of the younger wolves in the pack. "It's as if the knowledge was already there," replied Ethan, smiling at seeing the expression of surprise and joy on the boy's face. The medallion just awakened something that already existed. The medallion itself now rested in a special place inside the cave, protected not only by the wolves, but by a newly formed Council of Guardians, an interesting mix of members of the old society who had changed sides and new gift-bearers. Richard had become a key piece in this transition. His experience with the old structure of the society, combined with his willingness to embrace the changes, had made him a valuable advisor. "3 more families arrive tomorrow," said Sarah, coming out of the kitchen with a tray of lemonade. "We need to organize accommodation in the village." The small village near the park had transformed in recent weeks. Far from fearing the changes, the local residents had embraced their role as part of something extraordinary. Houses were shared, new constructions were emerging, and a unique community was forming, a place where humans and wolves coexisted in harmony. "Michael asked to speak with you," commented Elizabeth, climbing the porch steps after ending the training session. Her face showed a mixture of caution and hope. Ethan nodded, not surprised. After the incident in the cave, Michael had spent days in silence, processing the magnitude of the changes he had witnessed. His more radical followers had left, but he had remained, as if something prevented him from simply abandoning everything. "I'll see him this afternoon," replied Ethan. "Shadow will come with me." As if invoked by his name, the large black wolf emerged from the forest, gracefully climbing the porch steps to sit beside his young guardian. His golden eyes, always alert, seemed to carry an ancient wisdom. "Do you think he's ready to understand?" asked Sarah, her voice carrying the maternal concern that had never diminished even with all the changes. "He's already understanding," replied Ethan, petting Shadow's head. "In fact, I think Michael always knew deep down that the society's path was wrong. Sometimes fear makes us choose control instead of understanding." Elizabeth observed her, son with a mixture of pride and admiration. In a few weeks, Ethan had grown not only in his understanding of the gift, but in his wisdom to deal with the complexities that came with it. "I received news from Japan today," she commented, changing the subject. "An entire family awakened there. Apparently they have a special connection with the wolves of Hokkaido. Wolves are returning to places where they had disappeared," added Mark, his scientific side fascinated by the ecological changes that were occurring. "It's as if the awakening of the Guardians was restoring an ancient balance." A distant howl echoed through the forest, soon answered by others. It was a sound that now was part of the region's daily life, no longer a cause for fear, but a reminder of the deep connection that was being rebuilt. "Grandpa is coming to visit us next week," said Ethan, breaking a brief silence. William Wilson, after years of isolation, had finally decided it was time to reconnect with his family and with his own gift. "He has a lot to share," said Elizabeth, softly. "And a lot to learn too, we all do." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the afternoon breeze. Through his expanded connection, he could sense the distant echoes of other guardians awakening around the world. Each of them was like a small light turning on in the darkness, forming a web of consciousness that grew day by day. "Sometimes, I wonder," he said, opening his eyes, "if this is how wolves have always seen the world, all connected, part of something bigger." Shadow raised his head, his eyes meeting Ethan's in a silent understanding that went beyond words. The young guardian smiled, knowing that some answers didn't need to be spoken aloud. They were simply felt, understood at the deepest level of existence. The sun was beginning to set when Ethan and Shadow arrived at the small cabin where Michael had settled. It was a simple construction on the edge of the forest, surrounded by a newly planted garden, an attempt by the former society member to put down roots in his new way of life. Michael was waiting for them on the porch, his formal suit replaced by more casual clothes. His eyes, once hard and cold, now carried a mixture of weariness and curiosity. "Thank you for coming," he said, indicating 2 chairs. Shadow sat between them, his presence a silent reminder of the new order of things. "So you wanted to talk," replied Ethan simply, observing how Michael seemed to struggle with words. I've spent a lot of time thinking," Michael began, his hands restless in his lap, "about everything that happened, about everything we believed we were right to do." Ethan waited in silence, allowing the man to find his own way through his thoughts. "Yesterday something happened," continued Michael, his voice trembling slightly. "I was here working in the garden when a young wolf approached. He was limping, had a thorn stuck in his paw, and for the first time in my life I didn't feel afraid." A small smile formed on Ethan's lips. "What did you do?" "I helped him," replied Michael, still seeming surprised by his own actions. "I removed the thorn, cleaned the wound, and the most incredible thing is that he let me. He stayed there, trusting me." "Wolves have always known who we were," said Ethan softly, "even when we ourselves had forgotten." Michael nodded slowly, looking at the horizon where the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. "The society started with people who wanted to protect something precious. At some point we lost our way. We transformed protection into control, respect into fear. It's never too late to find the way back," replied Ethan. "That's why I want your help," said Michael, finally getting to the point of his summons. "There are others, like me, within the old society, people who are questioning everything they believed. Maybe I can be a bridge." Shadow raised his head, his golden eyes studying Michael with an intensity that made the man hold his breath. After a moment, the wolf stood up and, to everyone's surprise, approached Michael, allowing him to touch his black fur. "I think Shadow has already given his opinion," smiled Ethan. Silent tears ran down Michael's face as his hand trembled over the wolf's fur. It was as if decades of prejudices and fears were unraveling in that simple touch. "How do you do it?" he asked. "Deal with all this responsibility, with all this power, being so young?" Ethan thought for a moment before answering. "Maybe it's easier because I'm young. I don't have as much to unlearn, and besides, I'm never really alone." As if to emphasize his words, more wolves emerged from the forest, sitting in a semicircle around the porch. Michael's garden, with its newly planted flowers, seemed to come alive with their presence. "The true strength of the Guardians," continued Ethan, "isn't in the power we have over wolves, but in the partnership we form with them. It's an exchange, a balance." "Like the garden," murmured Michael, looking at his plants. "You don't control the growth. You just create the right conditions and trust the process." "Exactly," smiled Ethan. "And as for your offer, I think it's time to build bridges instead of walls." The last rays of the sun cast long shadows across the garden, and a gentle breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. It was a moment of transformation, not just for Michael, but for everything the old society represented. "Tomorrow," said Ethan, standing up, "we start working on this. There's a lot to be done, many bridges to be built." Michael nodded, a new determination in his eyes. Shadow moved away from him, returning to Ethan's side, but something had changed. A connection had been established, a first step taken towards a future where old enemies could become allies in protecting something greater than all of them. As Ethan and Shadow walked back home through the darkening forest, the wolves followed them like silent shadows. The young guardian smiled, feeling through his connection with them the ancient wisdom that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered, that the greatest changes begin not with grand gestures, but with small moments of understanding and acceptance. Autumn had arrived in Shenandoah National Park, painting the landscape with golden and red hues. On the porch of the Parker's house, William Wilson watched his grandson interacting with a group of young guardians. The family patriarch had arrived 3 days ago, and every moment since then had been a revelation. "He has a natural gift for teaching," commented William, as Ethan demonstrated to the new guardians how to establish a deeper connection with their wolf companions. "He always has," replied Sarah, serving tea to the man who, against all expectations, had become a welcome presence in their lives. Even before he knew who he was, William held the cup with slightly trembling hands, his eyes never leaving his grandson's figure. "You know that night, when I left him in the forest, I thought I was protecting him, but in reality I was just postponing the inevitable." "Fate has an interesting way of working," said Elizabeth, joining them on the porch. "He found exactly the family he needed to grow and become who he is." In the field in front of the house, Ethan had finished the demonstration. The young guardians were now practicing in pairs, each with their respective wolf, establishing the foundations of a connection that would last a lifetime. Shadow, as always, remained close to Ethan, his majestic bearing serving as an example for the younger wolves. "Michael has arrived," announced Mark, pointing to a jeep approaching on the dirt road. In recent months, the former society agent had become an invaluable ally. His experience and contacts were helping to establish a new structure, one that preserved ancient knowledge without resorting to control and fear. "He brought news from Northern Europe," said Michael, climbing the porch steps. His face, once always tense, now carried a serenity that transformed him. 3 more groups of guardians have manifested, and the most interesting part, wolves are returning to areas where they had disappeared decades ago. "Nature always finds a way to rebalance itself," commented Mark, his scientific side still marveling at the changes he observed. Ethan joined the group on the porch, followed by Shadow. The young guardian had grown not only in wisdom, but also in presence. There was a quiet strength in him, a balance between the power he carried and the humility of one who understood his responsibility. "The Guardian Council wants to hold the first official meeting here," said Michael, addressing Ethan. "They think it's appropriate, this being the place where everything restarted." "And what do you think?" asked Ethan, always valuing the opinion of the former adversary who had become a mentor in many aspects. Michael smiled, looking at the horizon where more wolves were emerging from the forest, attracted by the presence of the guardians in training. "I think it's perfect. This place has something special, something that goes beyond the gift, beyond the connection with wolves. It's as if the earth itself holds memories." "That's because it does," said William, rising with the help of his cane. "Come with me, there's something I need to show you." The group followed the Wilson patriarch along a path that wound through the property, arriving at a small elevation covered by ancient trees. There, partially hidden by vegetation, was a stone with engravings similar to those found in the cave. "This place," explained William, his voice laden with emotion, "was sacred to the first guardians. They came here not just to connect with wolves, but to reconnect with something deeper, the very essence of what it means to be a guardian." Ethan approached the stone, his fingers gently tracing the ancient engravings. Shadow followed him, his muzzle gently touching the young man's hand. "That's why the wolves have always been here," murmured Ethan, understanding. "They never abandoned their post, even when we forgot. And that's why this is the perfect place for the meeting," completed Elizabeth. "To remind everyone that the gift of the Guardians isn't just about power or special abilities. It's about remembering our connection to something greater than ourselves." The afternoon sun cast golden rays through the treetops, creating patterns of light and shadow that danced over the ancient stone. In the air there was a palpable energy, a sense that past and present were intertwining in a moment of profound significance. On the morning of the great meeting, the Parkers' property had transformed. Colorful tents dotted the field, and guardians from all parts of the world gathered, each accompanied by their respective wolf companion. It was an extraordinary sight, people from different cultures and backgrounds united by an ancestral gift that transcended borders. Ethan observed everything from atop his favorite oak tree, Shadow lying vigilantly at the foot of the tree. Down below he could see his family, all of them. Mark and Sarah animatedly conversing with guardians from Siberia about wolf migration patterns, Elizabeth and William welcoming a group of elders who had kept the traditions alive in secret for generations, and Michael coordinating the event's logistics with an efficiency that now served a higher purpose. "Are you nervous?" asked a familiar voice. It was Richard, who had just returned from a long journey around the world, where he had helped establish connections between different guardian communities. "A little," admitted Ethan, descending from the tree with his usual agility. "I didn't expect so many to come." "You awakened them," smiled Richard. "It was natural that they would want to meet the young guardian who changed everything." Before Ethan could respond, a murmur of expectation ran through the crowd. In the center of the field, where a large circular clearing had been prepared, the wolves began to position themselves spontaneously, forming a perfect ring. "It's time," said Elizabeth, approaching her son. "They're waiting." Ethan nodded, feeling the weight of the moment. Along with Shadow, he walked to the center of the circle. Hundreds of eyes, human and wolf, watched him in respectful silence. "Welcome," he began, his voice carrying a strength that went beyond his words. "A few months ago, when the medallion awakened our dormant gift, many feared it would bring chaos to the world. But what we see here today is different." He paused, looking into the eyes of each guardian present, feeling the connection that united them. "What we see is the restoration of an ancient balance, a reminder that we were never really separate from nature. We just forgot for a while." Shadow raised his head, emitting a long, deep howl that was immediately answered by all the wolves present. The sound was majestic, a wild symphony that made the air vibrate with ancient energy. "Each of us," continued Ethan when the echo of the howls diminished, "carries a responsibility, not just to our wolf companions, but to all creatures, to the earth itself. The gift of the guardians doesn't make us superior. It makes us guardians of a truth that the modern world has forgotten." Michael stepped forward, his presence now a symbol of transformation. "The old society believed that power should be controlled, feared. We were wrong. True power lies in understanding, in connection, in mutual respect. And that's why we're here," completed Elizabeth, "not just to celebrate our awakening, but to establish a new path, one that honors the past while embracing the future." One by one, the guardians began to approach the center of the circle, each bringing a small object, a stone, a feather, a seed. They deposited their offerings around Ethan and Shadow, creating a natural mosaic that symbolized the union of their different origins. "This is just the beginning," said Ethan, his voice soft but reaching every person present. "We have much to learn from each other, much to rebuild, but now we know we're not alone." The sun reached its highest point in the sky, and for a moment, time seemed to pause. In the silence that followed, something deep and ancestral pulsed through the earth, an energy that connected all those present in an invisible web of understanding and purpose. Mark and Sarah watched their son with teary eyes, proud not just of the young man he had become, but of the future he had helped awaken. William, leaning on his cane, smiled with the satisfaction of one who finally saw a circle complete. And there in the heart of Shenandoah National Park, where everything had begun on a starry night years ago, a new era was being born. An era where guardians no longer hid in the shadows, but walked openly under the sun, side by side with their wolf. Companions protecting not just ancient secrets, but the very hope of a more connected, more conscious, more complete world.